Hello and welcome to the Aviatrix Writers Room, where I'm back with my discussion with Pat Valdata, author of Crosswind and three other books that she has shared with us in the beginning of our interview. Pat, welcome back.
Thank you. Nice to be here.
Find a pen and fill the paper with the message that it wants to send.
Yeah, I'm so excited to talk about writing with you because
Mhm.
you seem to have quite an extensive resume there. Can you tell us about your writing journey?
Yeah, it started when I was a little kid and I learned how to read. And to me, being able to read just opened up this magic door to all sorts of experiences. And I've been an avid reader ever since. And I think reading is just the gateway drug for all writers because you read and you go, I'd like to try to do that. And then you start doing it and kind of write badly and then maybe take a few lessons and then kind of like flying, you learn how to do by doing, and the more you do it the better you get. So they're comparable.
Is it true that you started with an undergrad in journalism?
Yeah, I got an undergrad in journalism, and then in that era there were so many journalism grads that it was hard to get a job, and so more of the job ads were good for an English major than for a journalism major, so I went back to school right away and got another bachelor's in English and started working in corporate communications. But it wasn't where my heart was. And so after a few years of that kind of work, I went to grad school and went for a Master of Fine Arts degree in writing.
That's awesome. Yeah, I
Yeah.
did my MFA far more recently, later in my career, and
Hmm.
I actually, and it wasn't full time. Oh,
Hmm.
and that's right, yours wasn't either. Tell us
No,
about your program.
I went to Goddard College, which debuted the low residency concept in MFA. So it was wonderful because I would go there for a week or 10 days, meet with my mentors, and then go home and do the work. And it was wonderful. It was a great experience. I loved it.
Same format for mine. Yeah,
Hmm.
yeah, yeah. So, so aviation has always sort of been more of a hobby for you,
Yeah, yeah. I've never
and
been a
yeah,
professional pilot.
and then what did you do with all of this education that you had?
I ended up teaching at the college level for quite a few years. So I was an English and creative writing teacher. I've retired from that, but I will still do workshops, conference presentations, yeah, locally and
Okay.
work with the community more. It's a lot of fun to do that, and I don't have to grade any papers, which is great.
Yeah. So just to review, you in the first part of our conversation, you
Hmm.
told us about how Crosswind was your Master of Fine Arts creative thesis,
Right. Hmm.
and then you have these two other novels that are more
Hmm.
recently published. One is you said set sort of in the same town
Yeah.
as Crosswind is, this
Hmm.
fictional immigrant town,
Hmm.
but sort of back in time with these two characters who are sisters, and then you have this third novel that is more
Hmm.
recent, and then this collection of poetry. So that's a really broad, I mean, pretty great publication record.
Thanks.
So tell us about that process and the inceptions for these ideas, and what does your work look like? Like how do you get a book written? How do you finish a book? I need to. Hello, just asking for a friend. How do you finish a
Sure. How do
novel?
you finish a book? You put your butt in the chair and you keep working on it, which is the bottom line, so to speak. I don't know. I also have two other poetry books, but they're out of print, so I don't even talk about them because unfortunately they're out of print and the publisher is no more. So yeah, you just writing. People ask, how do you write a novel? Well, I don't. I write a scene at a time. I do a scene. I can't sit down to write a novel. That's just too many pages and it's too many characters. There's too much to think about. So, what I normally do is when I sit down to write, I look at the last couple of pages I wrote and kind of go through them and do a few edits just to kind of get in the swing of it. And then I can continue on to where I'm going next. But I just really do it scene by scene by scene, and that's the only way I know how to do it. I can't do too much. What's difficult about my current book is it's another piece of historical fiction like the other sister, and it requires a lot of research. So I can write for a while, then I get stuck and I have to do research, and as someone who was an English major, it's really easy to get lost in the research and spend way too much time in it. So I have to really try to balance those two things out. And so belonging to a critique group is helping me because I have to once a month at least present some new information to everybody. So it kind of keeps me moving forward a little bit.
Yeah, you have some accountability, right? You have to
Yeah.
show up with
Yeah.
something new.
And
Yeah.
that really
Yeah.
helps. Yeah.
That I agree. That's really helpful. When you're in that phase of writing, it's really
Mhm.
helpful. When you're revising it, for me, the whole critique group thing dynamic changes a little bit.
Right. Hmm.
Yeah. So
Hmm.
I'm in a moment right now where like I'm gonna take a break from critique group
Hmm.
because I know what I need to do
Right.
and I don't really need any input on it right now. So
Hmm.
yeah,
Hmm.
that ebbs and flows, right? Like
It
where
does.
your writing is and what you need ebbs and flows,
Hmm.
but yeah, but you can always
Hmm.
contribute to somebody else's work by
Sure. Sure.
staying in a
And it
critique
helps
group.
you with your own work when you read what other people are doing. It really helps you
Yeah.
with your own. So, yeah.
Yeah. No, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's been really a great experience for me being
Hmm.
a part of different critique groups and evolving and changing, and getting fresh
Hmm.
perspectives. So that's kind of what we're trying to do in the Aviatrix writers is to set people up for success by
Hmm.
pairing them with critique partners that
Hmm.
hopefully can help move their work along.
Yeah. Great
So
idea.
the poetry thing, I took a poetry class,
Yeah.
and it was the hardest I ever did. It really stretched me
Yeah.
creatively,
Yeah.
and I produced some. I think, I mean, because you spoke earlier about actually in the collection that you are reprinting now,
Hmm.
that there are some that are strictly adhering to form.
Right.
And that is a very challenging thing to do. But when you
Hmm.
can do it, you can turn out some pretty good stuff. I
Yeah.
think, like,
Yeah. I mean,
I
things,
say so myself,
yeah, it takes your writing in unexpected places,
Correct.
especially if you get used to writing. Like my first book was almost all free verse because that's what you're taught these days. And
Yeah.
I was getting a little tired of that and I wanted to do something different. And so
Yeah.
I started going to conferences about writing poetry in form and I learned a lot and thought, well, let me try this because it really sounds like a fun challenge. And it really was.
Yeah. It's a fun
Yeah.
challenge. And you can see how people who develop that craft, how it comes into their writing. Now, I don't know if you were doing poetry before you wrote Crosswind or not, or if you just have this beautiful knack of describing things, but
Thank
tell
you.
me.
Well, I both. I do both. I've been writing
You,
poetry and fiction all along. I
yeah,
did study fiction for my MFA because I hadn't gotten any training in that. But
right.
my last faculty mentor was Mark Doty, who's an amazing poet. And
Okay.
he was very encouraging for me to write both. And
Yeah.
so I did, and I'm really glad that he did. And then I found an online community of poets who were super wonderful and encouraging and continued to encourage me. And so,
Well,
yeah, I do
yeah.
both. And the poetry I think informs my fiction because I do try to get good imagery in there so people can picture the action easily and the
Yeah.
setting, picture all that. And then lots of my poems have a real strong narrative component to them because I write
Yeah.
stories and I love the story in the poem. So I really like combining both of those. And so that's
That's
kind of
wonderful. So,
what
so
I
I
do.
mean, all of that is really, evident in. I haven't even read the poetry book yet, but, and I can't wait to read your other novels. But like
Thank you.
in this book, um, and we talked a little bit about this last night about how setting as character,
Hmm.
and I just for as a mentor text for somebody who's really trying to um, develop the craft of especially like descriptive,
Hmm.
really dense description. I think that one of my favorite books for this is, and it's not my favorite book for the way that everybody else seems to love it, but Goldfinch
Uh-huh.
is a very popular novel.
Hmm.
And what I think he does very well in that book is he gives you these very rich descriptions of people in
Hmm.
a paragraph or two.
Right.
Very rich. Like
Hmm.
it tells you so much. And that's what you do in this book. And I'll just
Thank you.
point out, like on page 4, the couple of paragraphs that you have describing this
Hmm.
neighborhood that Helen is in, and then you do it in several other places in the book. I
Hmm.
have all my little corner dog-eared pages of things that I love. But so just talking to our aspiring fiction writers who
Hmm.
really want to develop their craft, of whom I am one, I highly recommend exploring poetry. It
Yep.
definitely, like, some people are just creative,
Hmm.
flighty, imaginative people. I'm not that. I am creative, but I'm very much grounded in reality. So, like, I'm not a fan. I'm never going to be a fantasy writer, but doing
Yeah.
that really helped me
Hmm.
develop some new tools in my
Yeah.
writer's box. So I highly
Yeah.
recommend it.
Thank you. And
Um,
I love fantasy. I mean, I love good fantasy, and I'm a Tolkien geek from the time I was in high school. I
ah,
used to read The Lord of the Rings every summer,
yeah,
over and over again. And again, he's someone who can build worlds and
right.
show you new places and describe people very well. When I was a kid, I used to love the books of Mary Stewart. I'm sure her work is not well known now. She was a British writer, but she set her stories in Greece and a number of other locations. And she was always wonderful about describing the setting and the people so well that you could really picture what was happening in your
Yeah,
mind. I mean, I absolutely loved that.
yeah,
And Daphne du Maurier is another one who's really excellent at that. So
yeah.
I
I
think
mean, that's
it's important to read other people's work because
yeah,
then you see how other people do it. And
exactly
so
right.
young students always would come to me, how do I become a better writer? So, well, you've got to read.
Read. Yeah,
I would have kids writing poetry and I would say, oh, well, who are your favorite poets? Oh, I don't have any. Well, then how do
yeah,
you know what you're doing if you haven't read anybody else's poetry? So I would always
right.
encourage people to read and give them suggestions. So, yeah.
That's great. So you wrote a master's thesis and
Hmm.
then you got it published. How does that work?
It took much longer to get it published than it took to write it. I can
Oh,
tell you that. And it was just, I tried to get an agent and that didn't work very well. And then I tried to work with the agent I got, she tried doing a like big book contract with a small press and that didn't work. And so the press that was interested in my book turned me down because she just came at them with all this paperwork and all these demands, and that's not how they worked. But the guy who turned me down felt really bad about it. And then later on, he told me about Wind Canyon and put me in contact with the folks at Wind Canyon, and they published it. So that was almost luck more than anything. And I've never had an agent since. I tried again with an agent and it didn't work. And the other sister, I mean, she tried shopping it around for 2 years and none of the big presses she worked with took it. But then again, I found a small press when I was at a writers conference. And so I strongly recommend going to conferences. There are a lot of local conferences and regional conferences, and then the big national ones, the AWP, the Association of Writers and Writing Programs. They have a book fair that has 800 vendors in it in a typical year, and probably three-quarters of them are publishers. So
yeah,
it's a place to go and meet publishers of small press publishers who do fiction and poetry and nonfiction, because there are a lot of memoir writers out there. And so I recommend doing that kind of thing, networking as much as you can, joining writing groups, whatever you can to meet other people who write, because it is a very solitary activity and we
yeah.
do need to help each other. So, yeah,
Yeah,
that's what I
so
recommend.
you mentioned local conferences. Are there
Hmm.
any specific organizations that you recommend?
Well, I live in Maryland, so there's the Maryland Writers Association, and our annual conference happens over 2 days in October every year.
Mhm.
And I also, because of where I live, I'm on the east side of the Chesapeake Bay, so I joined the Eastern Shore Writers Association, and we
Okay,
have an annual conference in March called Bay to Ocean. And
nice.
so I go to that too. That's a 1 day conference.
Yeah,
And so those are the two that I'm most familiar with. But if anybody living elsewhere, you go to the library in your area or your local arts council, you can find these kinds of things, or just Google Writers Association, and it'll come up
yeah,
if you have a local Writers Association.
yeah.
Yeah.
And you mentioned awards that you might have
Mhm.
gotten an award for one of your books. Talk about that. How did that work for you?
Well, for poetry, it's really common to get a book published by entering a contest, and that's what I did with Where No Man Can Touch. So I entered a competition for the Donald Justice Poetry Prize, which is specifically for people who write formal verse.
Okay.
And I think it's the only one for people who write formal verse. Most prizes go to people who write free verse. And I was astonished when it won. When it really was, because it was the first time I'd ever tried anything like that.
That's
Um,
amazing.
but once you have a book published, there are contests that you can enter, like the National Federation of American Presswomen holds a contest, and they've got a Delaware chapter, and I put Eve's Daughters into their competition in Delaware, and it won for the novel. And then they entered it into the national competition, and it got an honorable mention. So I was really thrilled with that.
Did you have to enter these books before they get published?
No, this was a post publication.
Yeah, but each of the prizes have like different rules, so you have to really pay attention. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and you have to follow the rules and the entries exactly
Yeah.
as written.
Yeah.
Yeah, but it's worth trying. Now I have to caution it because most contests do have a fee to enter,
Hmm.
and it can be 20, 25, $30.
Okay.
So you have to think about that carefully. You have to make sure that what you write is in line with the kinds of things that the contest people will want, and
Right.
then pick and choose your contests carefully.
Yeah.
And it's much less common in fiction to do that. It's much more common in poetry to get
Okay.
published through a contest.
Okay.
So I
That's
feel very
great.
lucky.
Yeah. And so, what was the most recent publication? I mean,
When Oman,
aside from the poetry one, what's your most
Eve's
recent?
Daughters, it came out in 2020, right in the middle of COVID, which is a
Oh
very
man.
difficult time to launch a book. So we tried a
Yeah.
couple of online events, but it's not the same as being able to go places. Like I'm going to be reading at the
So,
Writer Center in September, and I'm doing a reading and book signing at a store in Rock Hall called Selkie Books,
yeah.
which I'm really looking forward to up in Rock Hall, Maryland.
Yeah. So, who's
So
setting these events up for you? Tell me about that.
Well, I did hire a publicist this time because I just was so busy getting everything ready. And
Hmm.
I hired a publicist who worked with me for about 4 to 6 weeks. It was a very short term, very specific. Please help me with my social media and help find me some events. And she did, and it was really great. So my June calendar has been really busy, which is wonderful. But you can also network with people you know. I know someone who lives in a retirement community in Newport News, and she's invited me down to be one of their guest speakers. So
Yeah.
in July, I'm going to go down and visit her and talk to the people who live there.
Yeah.
So there are all kinds of opportunities like that. So it's a really good idea to get online and look for these things.
Yeah.
Um, and if you subscribe to a magazine like The Writer or Writer's Digest or Poets and Writers, they often have upcoming deadlines in the back of the magazine, and you can use those to see people who might be looking for work and then
Okay.
send your work away.
Okay. That's great. Well, so, what advice do you have for any aspiring writers that we haven't talked about so far?
Oh,
Any
have
resources that you recommend beyond the things that we've talked about?
all the things we talked about are pretty much everything I know about. But the main thing is to just believe in yourself because you're going to get a lot of rejection as you go through this process. Many, many rejections. It happens all the time, and you can't take it personally. You have to understand that that piece of writing just didn't work for that reader on that day. It's a
Yeah.
very specific thing. Sometimes an editor might really love your work one day, and the next day they may not. And even famous writers and poets get rejected all the time. It happens.
Yeah.
So that's the hardest thing to learn. Is the hardest lesson is to send your work out because it's your blood, sweat, and tears, and you love it, and you're hoping everybody else thinks it's as wonderful as you do, and then someone comes back and just says no, thank you.
Hmm.
This doesn't
Yeah.
suit our needs at this time, and you get this very blank rejection, and you don't know why it got rejected or what. And all you have to do is just shake it off and send it to the next person on your list, and just keep on doing that, and just keep
Yeah.
doing it. And it's a tough part of the business, but it's just what happens.
Yeah. So what's next for you? What are you working on?
I am working on another novel, another historical novel, and it's set during World War II. And I'm going to follow a B 26 bomber as it's being built at the Martin Aircraft Plant in Middle River, Maryland. And it's being built by a group of Rosie the Riveters. And then I'm going to have it being flown by some of the WASPs, the Women's Air Force Service pilots. And then I'm going to have it head overseas and fly air support during the Battle of the Bulge.
Oh, I
So
love this so
that's the
much.
next one. So
I love this so
thanks.
much. This is gonna, you know what? You know what I love about this? Well, first of
What?
all, the aircraft is the main character, but
Yeah.
also that I love that idea, but
Yeah.
also that it's gonna bridge, it'll bridge, uh, the genre of, or, you know, the niche of books featuring women in aviation
Right.
into the history buffs and
Hmm.
really not only reading, like, I think that, I mean, I could be wrong. I may be speaking for them, and I hate making gender generalizations. People hear me say that a million times on
Yeah.
here, but I do think, like, I see the way that the men in the book clubs that I frequent in Facebook, how
Hmm.
they interact with material there, and
Hmm.
how, in many cases,
Hmm.
not making a blanket statement, but how in many cases our stories tend to be against the backdrop
Hmm.
of a particular historical period and aviation
Hmm.
specifically, but really dealing more about the emotional journey.
Hmm.
Whereas they seem to be more interested in the technical details
Right.
of the aircraft and its
Hmm.
capabilities and how it
Hmm.
was used in the, you know, strategically, et cetera,
Right.
in battle. And
Hmm.
so, like, anywhere where we can bring those two together
Hmm.
and get us talking, and
Yeah.
I love it. And I
I
think
hope
this
so.
is a book idea that will really do that. I
Yeah.
love it. I
Thank
cannot
you.
wait, and we're gonna have to have you back on and talk about it in the book club.
It's going to be a
Yep.
while because I'm only halfway through the first draft, so this is still very
It's
much an
okay.
ongoing project.
We will be here waiting
Good.
patiently
Great.
for that art
Thank
to
you.
come.
Thank you so
Well,
much.
thank you. This has been lovely. I always love
Yes.
getting these personal mentoring sessions on writing and publishing,
Hmm.
and we appreciate your contributions there.
Thank you.
Look forward to seeing you in the book club. Any parting
You bet.
words?
Um, keep reading, keep writing, and keep soaring.
Absolutely, all the above. Thank you, Pat.
To save for later, you cannot trust it to come again. To wait for you to find a pen and fill the paper with the message that